Hi everyone, welcome back. We're going to be finishing up our coverage of the pre-Ottoman period that is medieval Anatolia. We're going to be looking at the question of nomads and what they thought they were doing as they fought and tried to conquer various parts of medieval Anatolia and the Balkans. And specifically, we're going to be looking at what historians interpret their motivations. So, just a bit of background again. Remember that all of these people moving into Anatolia often are nomadic people. There's still a few small groups of nomads left, such as the Sarı Keçililer, the yellow goat people, still migrating between the high pasture and low pastures. But for the most part, there are no more nomads today. We don't think about nomads very much. Um, but we should, because this was a major dynamic in human history, and then often the nomads had the upper hand. Uh, Though there is often, of course, a symbiotic relationship between settled agriculturalists and nomadic peoples. So the nomads brought, animals, meat and wool, dairy, all these other material that came from animals. The agriculturists, in turn, traded cereals and farm crops. But at the same time, when things got a bit tense or there were limited resources, nomads were quick to raid settled communities, steal away from them not only animals and food, but of course sometimes people as well. And that's because nomads were so mobile, because they were moving on animals all the time. They were very militarily capable, and that's why so many early modern or medieval states in the Middle East relied upon nomadic groups to fuel their armies or to staff their armies. At the same time, states generally, especially modern states, see nomads as a threat because they cannot be controlled, they cannot be settled, and then therefore force them to abandon their nomadic ways and settle down. Now, as you know, in the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, the Byzantines lost, and it opened up a kind of floodgate of nomadic migration into medieval Anatolia. And of course, this was partially the design of the Seljuks, who were the dynasty ruling basically Iran and Iraq at that time. They wanted to keep the nomads from raiding their own lands, and so they funneled them into Anatolia. There was, as this group of Turkic nomads came in, basically in the 1100s, they set up a dynasty, a branch of the Seljuk Empire, with their center in Konya. And this kind of grew in different ways, but it was eventually taken out by the Mongols in 1258 or so, 1250s. And in many ways, Western Anatolia was a perfect place for nomads because it had different elevations, different ecologies in which you could pasture animals in different times. So in the winter, you go down to lower elevations to the sea. In the summer, when that area gets hot and arid, you go up to the highlands where there's plenty of grazing. There was two major migrations of Turkish nomads, as we've talked about. One is the first one after the Battle of Manzikert, right, the one that ended up setting up the Seljuks. Then there's another one that's basically after 1240, the second half of the 13th century, as all these nomads from Central Asia flee the Mongols, who are themselves nomads. They flee them to as far away as they can go. Where they end up is basically Western Anatolia, into the Byzantine frontier. And that is what they called this area. Had a word for this called Uj. Uj just means frontier in Turkish, in early Turkish. And on one hand, they just wanted a place for their animals, and that's because the Mongols just needed so many damn animals to fuel their armies, right? For every person or something, there was like 5 or 6 extra animals in the Mongol army. And so the Mongols, for example, when they conquered Anatolia and took out the Seljuks, they also brought in 3 million animals, which is a ton, way more than probably the population at the time, human population. And so in the 1300s, a whole bunch of different emirates or beyliks or principalities emerged, and you can see them on this map. Here is the one of the Ottomans, Osman over here, but there's a whole bunch of other ones. Probably the most important one was this Germayan or Germayan. Also this one around here, Aydin, which I don't see here, but is Menteşe or Big. All sorts of different people in this period. The Ottomans were one of the smaller ones, and we'll look into why is it that they were so successful. But before that, we have to figure out their motivation. And specifically, what was the impact of nomads on the local population? As we'll see in the question on Islamization, did they displace the locals, or did they end up slowly converting them? Or not even purposefully converting them, but the locals became converted to Islam. And this leads also to the bigger question, which is what is actually motivating this conquest? As they're moving in, are they just looking for material gain? Are they just looking for spoils, for slaves, for animals, for pasture land? Or are they being motivated by something bigger, which is, maybe a religious motivation? And this ultimately leads to the question of, for our week in this lecture, which is why did the Ottomans succeed and ultimately these other principalities fail? What is it that set the Ottomans apart and from all those other different principalities? So let's look at the frontier. Remember, there's a word in Turkish for this. This is what they called the uj. The people, the frontier lords were called uj beyleri. I mean, like bey is a lord. Uj beyleri is lords of the frontier, frontier lords, etc. And now there's a specific characteristic of the frontier. It's not just, the place where one polity ends and another begins, but it is also it's a mentality. It's a way of being. It's a political space as well. And that's one, because it's defined by its violence and lawlessness, right? There is no central authority. There's many different competing authorities. In many ways, the only people who are able to say have power are the ones that are able to exercise power, physical, violent force sometimes. And because of this lack of state control, there's always opportunities for people to reinvent themselves, to emerge from basically nothing, or to come in from a new place and rise up through military skill, through trading skill, or through other different worlds. And so it's a very dynamic type of space socially. And it's constantly expanding, right? So the frontiers don't just stay in one place. They keep moving on to the next territory. Now, there's a whole variety of frontiers that emerge in the 1200s across Islamic lands. Probably the one we'll be talking about is here in Anatolia, but there's also some in Russia, as we'll see, as we've talked about, and a different frontier space in which Muslims were basically being pushed back by Christian soldiers and kingdoms over here in Iberia. Other major frontiers, probably the one that's closest to Anatolia, is over here in Bengal, in kind of eastern and central India. We don't even have to think so broadly. We can even go back to the experience of America to look for frontiers. Of course, America was very much defined by the frontier, the constant movement of settlers, troops, and other people, again, into the West, starting from the original 13 colonies, moving then into the kind of Midwest and then further into the West, each time pushing the frontier further and further out. Now, the question, of course, is in medieval Anatolia, who precisely were the settlers and who were the natives? Does this paradigm of American settler colonialism apply to medieval Anatolia? And what is actually driving the migration and conquest of North America in comparison to that of Anatolia in the 13th, 14th century? Keep that in mind. Think about it. We can go into more in discussion. Now, the real question is, how should historians approach this moment of frontier life and conquest? And here there's actually a lot of differing visions of historians. And I'm going to start with some of the oldest. For example, older historians generally focused until the 1980s or so, 1990s. When you were speaking about the Turks, they were always seen as a destructive force coming in and destroying the civilized Greek, Christian, Byzantine, etc. And we can see this, for example, in the work of Spiros Virionis, who's a famous Byzantinist who used to work at UCLA. He wrote about what he called the nomadization, Islamization process. So for him, the movement of these Turkish-speaking nomads who were nominally Muslim into Anatolia, into Byzantine areas, was ultimately a destructive process for some. He saw Turkish expansion as occurring by nomadic forces, and then as these nomads came in, they took slaves, they raided villages, they slowly destroyed the basis for settled life, and so villages were abandoned. Places that had higher levels of population disappeared, and this set off a sort of destructive vicious cycle in which the Byzantines lost more and more tax revenue and therefore were not able to raise enough money, and therefore were unable to fight off the nomads, and therefore the nomads were able to gain more and more territory, eventually leading to the destruction of the Byzantine church/state, and with that the ultimate rise of the Ottomans amongst all the other beyliks and principalities out there. Now, what he looks at, for example, is things like he'll look at basically Byzantine sources and try to look at reports from those sources of places destroyed by Turkish, by nomadic Turks. Right, so if you look in the index of his book, The Decline of Medieval Hellenism, you'll find it, for example, at this site. Towns, villages, provinces destroyed, pillaged, enslaved, massacred, or besieged in Western Asia Minor. Here's East Asia Minor, and you can go through this like list, and he has a key: P for pillaged, X for sacked and destroyed, E for enslaved, C for captured and massacred, B besieged, F flight. And so for him, basically the combination of different pillaging and basically sacks and destruction spells the end of Christian life. So it's basically a vision of displacement rather than conversion or slow change. Now, as we'll talk about in the Islamization video, this doesn't really been borne out by the DNA evidence, but there's still a lot more to explore. And I don't think we can discount the fact that these nomadic Turkish groups were raiding, right? They were seeking out material wealth in many ways. And that was either taking the form of slaves, of animals, or of coins or crops. Now, not all the Byzantine sources were actually antagonistic. In fact, if you look through the Byzantine sources more openly, there's actually a large amount of different material there, including people who had spent time as Ottoman captives or as visitors to the Ottoman. So we can look at, for example, Gregory of Palamas, the Archbishop of Thessaloniki. He was captured by the Ottomans in 1354. He lived for them for about a year and a half, while waiting to be ransomed. And when he was there, he actually left his impressions. He noticed actually there's a lot of different Christians living in Ottoman territories. They're living in these cities. They don't have a problem. And he was actually asked to debate in front of the Sultan, kind of for the sake of Christianity, to see which religion was better, Islam or Christianity. And this goes back a long time to a practice that Islamic rulers would have, where they'd have these sort of large theological debates in front of them. They'd had that since the year 800. On the Turkish side, it's actually quite hard to figure out what they were doing, because there's basically no written sources from that period. There's almost nothing. As we'll see, there is an inscription, there's some coinage, and maybe a document or two, but it's really very little out there. Instead, what we have are frontier tales and stories, right? So we have things like the Batalname, the Book of Dede Korkut. Dede Korkut is a figure who's a bard who's telling these tales. The Batalname tells the story of Sayyid Batal Ghazi. Batal means hero, so he's a hero and he's a Ghazi, as we'll talk about in a second. Saltuk Name means book, right? Like Batal Name, Saltuk Name, Danishman Name. These are stories of their heroes. In this case, the hero is this guy named Sarı Saltuk. Then there's the Danishman Name, another one. And then there's hagiographies, just stories of saints and holy men around that time. And these were always transmitted orally in that period over many different centuries. You can imagine around a campfire in different ways. So let's look at one of them, right? We discussed this. This is one of the primary sources in your reading. It's the story of Kan Tureli, son of Kanlı Koca. And as you can see here, it says, "Oh my Khan." Khan is a reference to the guy who there is a listener, right? The listener is the ruler who's or whoever is the tribal leader who's out there listening to these stories as they be recited. And these are all basically these sources are one of the few things we have from medieval Anatolia. We don't have much else out there, but they weren't actually recorded in the time of medieval Anatolia. They were actually, most of them, written down in the 1500s or 1600s, and we can use this in different ways to eventually jump into the history of that period. By the way, there are actually a variety of similar types of heroes, frontier type of lore in different frontier societies, right? So we have, or if you look into Iberia, you have the famous figure of El Cid. El Cid is supposed to be, he's a Christian warrior. He fights for both Muslim and Christian kingdoms. But his name, El Cid, comes from the Arabic Al-Sayyid. Al-Sayyid is a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, or a respected figure, a lord, basically. And so he undertakes the same type of gallant adventures that Conquests does, but in Iberia. So it's interesting how similar types of literature, similar types of figures emerge in different frontiers. And if we look, for example, in the American frontier, we say the same thing in the figure of the cowboy in the cowboy movie, perhaps not as prominent today as it was in the 20th century, but we have a whole variety of different interpretations of them. We have the cowboy in the white hat, etc. But we also have variations on that story, such as Clint Eastwood in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And of course, we also have as a constant theme, not only that the cowboys are fighting the Indians, but the cowboy and Indians always have some sort of cooperation, right? And so in the case of a Lone Ranger seen here, he always has his Indian sidekick, right? So there's always some sort of synthetic interaction going on, right? This isn't just an oppositional story. Similarly, if we return back to Anatolia and we look at the Byzantine side of things, we actually also find the tales of frontier warriors and heroes in their literature. In fact, we have this figure called Digenes Akritas. Akritas, the second word here, means Byzantine frontier warrior, right? They're the same type of people. They're out there fighting the Turks, the nomads on the frontier, gallivanting around for the sake of their religion or their people or whatever. But if you look again at his name, Digenes, Di means two, Genes means blood, so he's mean two-blooded because he's actually the son of a mixed marriage, right, between a Greek woman and a Turkish father, or vice versa. I can't remember. But you always have these sort of hybridic figures on the frontier as the classic warriors. Now, if we look into these Turkish frontier tales, and you look into the work of, for example, Kantureli, what you won't find is a lot of historical detail. You won't say like, well, we conquered this fort in this period, and this is who our troops were. That you find some of that in chronicles written much later on, but they're hard to get at. But in this Turkish frontier material, which is recorded or kind of more or less reflective of the stories that were being told on the frontier, we can use it. We can look at the ideas and terms that they're talking about to understand what it is that they want to get across. And one of the terms that keeps coming up again and again and again is this term gaza. Gaza, right? Someone who does gaza is called a ghazi. Now, you might be thinking, what is this related to the place like Gaza Strip, Gaza in Palestine? No relation whatsoever. The word Gaza in Palestine is actually an older thing, pre-Arabic, so it's not connected to that. What Gaza means, or Gaza means, it means two things. If you look in a dictionary today, it basically means to raid. But in the past, in this period, we know that Gaza means raiding for booty, that is raiding for money, but also fighting for the faith. So these seems to be two contradictory ideas, but which one is it? What could it be? How does it work? Interestingly, if we look at the earliest inscription that we have of the Ottoman Empire, that is found on this mosque in Bursa, above the roof. So if you look at this picture of the mosque It's above this roof. Now, it probably wasn't there originally. It was probably an inscription that they took out and then put into a new mosque that was rebuilt. So it's probably in a much more visible place before. But if we look at it, this inscription basically dedicates a mosque. Okay, so he says, starts off with a little bit of prayers, etc. He is God, the one, the God eternal, blah, blah, blah. He neither begets nor is begotten. There's nothing like him. Okay, you get the year 738, which is in our calendar 1337. May God pardon the founder of this place of prostration. A place of prostration, a masjid, a sajda, a place where you pray is a mosque. He is now you're going to describe the guy who founded or paid for this mosque. He is the great Emir, the exalted, the mujahid, the person who does jihad in the way of God, Sultan of the Ghazis, Ghazi, son of the Ghazi, dauntless in sovereignty and spirituality, ward in the borderlands, hero of the age, Orhan, son of Osman. So this is the son of the very first, kind of the founder of the Ottoman dynasty, Osman. May God prolong his life. He commanded the blessed prostration. Okay, blah, blah, blah. What I want you to point out here, of these titles, he has Emir, Exalted, Mujahid, and then he has 3 titles that use the word Ghazi, right? So obviously this meant something to them. Like the word Ghazi was important. But why was it important and what did it actually mean? So here we have to look into different historical interpretations of what the role of Gaza was. So the earliest one, this guy Paul Wittek, who was writing kind of back in the 20s and 1920s and 30s, he says that what this shows is that these nomadic Turks weren't just interested in raiding for the sake of money. They were actually just motivated by religious fervor. They wanted to conquer Christians. They wanted to turn this place into an Islamic land. But so very quickly, though, or at least over the course of a few decades, historians started objecting to this thesis. They said, no, it's impossible that these people were motivated by religious fervor. Even if they mentioned Gaza, what they're really being pushed at was material gain. They wanted booty and power. And they point to the fact that there's this constant cooperation between Turkish Muslims and Greek and Armenian Christians. Not only was it that you constantly find Christian soldiers in Ottoman armies, in these Beylik armies, in these Muslim armies, there are a lot of Christian soldiers. Therefore, we cannot say Turks were motivated by religion, or they were, if they were, then they were just bad Muslims. So one of the things they point out to, for example, is the fact that, let me stop. So they keep pointing to the fact that there's a lot of intermarriage. So if we even go back to the Seljuks, right, that dynasty that was ruling Anatolia in the 1100s, they're marrying, each of these rulers is marrying a Greek, has a Greek wife or concubine. When we look at the princesses of Trebizond, a Byzantine outpost on the North Black Sea, we can see that actually a lot of them ended up marrying also Muslim and Turkoman leaders, right? So these two warring sides are actually connected by marriage in many ways. Some of them actually, as you'll see, will be part of the lineage of the Safavids in Iran, which we'll get to in a later session. Even the Ottomans were actually intermarried with the Byzantine princesses. So Ghazi Emir Orhan, that is Orhan, the son of Osman, the founder, right, has a marriage with a Byzantine princess, Theodora Cantacuzene, in 1346. So there's constant alliances. So how could we say that these people are fighting for the faith when they're actually allying with these Christian powers? Moreover, when you look at the march lords, the frontier lords, a lot of them turn out to be Christians, such as this guy, Evranos Bey. You can go to his tomb today. There's a Muslim tomb in the middle of Greece and Yanitsa where he had died fighting for the Ottomans, or afterwards, maybe I can't remember. He conquered this area and then set up his place there. But he was fighting for the sake of the Ottomans. And we can look at other Christian march lords fighting for the Ottomans in this period in the 1300s, such as this guy, Gazi Köse Michael the Beardless, or this guy, Gazi Evranos, whose tomb we just saw. They are a lot of Christians fighting on the side of the so-called Muslims. So how is it that we can say that the Muslims were fighting for religious reasons? One way of kind of squaring the circle or circling the circle, yeah, is to say that, okay, well, they said they were fighting for Islam, but they don't really know Islam. They were bad Muslims. It wasn't real or Orthodox Muslim. It was a sort of popular Islam centered around Mongol or Central Asian ideas, but it's not really the real Islam. Now, this keeps going. So, for example, the historian Rudy Paul Lindner argues that it cannot have been Islam that motivated Turkish nomads, because, as he says, Islam cannot include like a large polity of Christians and Muslims. Instead, they were motivated by material ends, and more importantly, it was the tribal structure of the Ottomans. That all of these Turkoman groups, these nomadic Turkish groups, they were tribes, and tribes are technically flexible unit. They're united by blood. So even though it seems something that's not an open group, new anthropological research says that tribes actually can expand and develop and bring in people who are not part of them. And that is how we get these inclusive groups of Muslims and Christians. And we shouldn't really be speaking about Islam at all. Now, that was written in the 80s. The current synthesis of this is a work by Jamal Kafadar. He teaches at Harvard still. He asks, well, why is it that we can't say that these Turkish frontier warriors fight for the faith? Why can't they fight both for Islam and ally with Christians? Why is it that makes them bad Muslims? Why then they could also clearly believe that they were fighting for what they saw as Islam. And if they had Christians that helped them along the way, that's not a contradiction in any way. And in fact, he points out this idea that these people were living in a state of metadoxy. It's not that they were good or bad Muslims. It's that they didn't even have the standard of being a good or bad Muslim. They didn't have orthodoxy. They didn't have orthopraxy. They didn't have ideas about what it meant to be a correct Muslim. And therefore, in that situation, what they defined as Islam and what they defined as fighting for the faith often took hold. So, what do you think drove the Turkish conquerors? Is it ultimately ideology, religious ideology? Is it material gain? Is it both at the same time? And more importantly, what kind of Islam did these Turkic nomads subscribe to? What is it that Islam meant to them? And that's what we're going to look at the other lessons.